All right, everyone. So this is a quick lecture on basically how to break down an argument. And we've kind of talked about the fact that everything that you do, everything you see is an argument. Whether it's the TV show you're watching or whether you're trying to decide with a friend where to go to dinner or even just trying to motivate yourself to get out of bed in the morning, that everything is an argument. So I'm going to kind of walk you through how to break down or read an argument. These are the different pieces of an argument that you naturally encounter, and you may not even realize it every day. So the first thing when you have an argument is you want to look at the title. So I want you to think pull up any news article on CNN or BBC or Fox or whatever it might be, and first thing, of course, is the title. When you're looking at the title, there's a lot of things that you can tell beyond just what the title is. So, for example, if you had a title that said, Why America is Already Great, a 2016 election analysis, there's some implications in there that you might already be realizing without even reading the article. So there's things that it can tell you. So things like what it's going to be about, obviously. What is the writer's stance on the topic? So you can tell if it says, Why America is Already Great is probably going to be something that doesn't agree with Trump's side. And then you get a feel for the tone. And the tone here you can tell is a little bit contradictory. It's a little bit argumentative. So you're going to think about the bias and the stance of the author and the implications of these unspoken elements. You're also going to do a quick overview. So you're going to look at the author's name. You want to know who wrote it. If it's, John Smith off the street, maybe not quite as credible as, someone like Rachel Maddow. You look at their credentials. So why should you believe this person? What credentials do they have? What credentials do they offer for you? What makes them a credible writer and a credible source? Look at the source of the article or the essay itself. So if it comes from something like the Washington Post or the New York Times, that's probably a credible source. But if it comes from something like, Lisa Smith's blog posts from 2012, it's probably not going to be a credible source in that sense. You want to preview it, so you just want to do a quick skim looking at the headlines and the different sort of aspects and elements just to make sure that the article is something that is going to be useful for you. And then you also want to think about the issue before you read. So you want to think of what your own opinion is before you read, and then kind of evaluate the piece as you're working through based on your own beliefs and strategies. Now, it doesn't mean close your mind to what the author is saying. It just means have an opinion before so that you're not easily swayed by everything that you read. So, how to read basically a very quick argument. You read it once to get a good impression of it. And then read it again and annotate as you're reading. So what this does is allow you to digest information much more easily than if you were trying to read and annotate all together, because by reading it once and allowing yourself to really delve into it without worrying about notes and different things, you're giving yourself a lot of space and time to just let your brain kind of formulate its own opinion before you go in and start breaking it down analytically. While you're annotating, you want to highlight or underline anything you don't understand, and that way you can go back after and kind of find those pieces that you might need a little more information on. Okay, so when you summarize, summary and synthesis are two different things. I'm going to talk about synthesis in a minute, but summaries are really just very simple ways for you to encapsulate what you've read, and they're really, really helpful if you struggle with really understanding content and understanding comprehension. This might be a really good tool for you. At the bottom of your article or wherever, you might just write a very short summary at the end, and what you should do is really 4 things. So if you struggle with comprehension, a good thing to do is read it more than once. As I said, read it once for just understanding and then a second time with annotations. When you're reading it on the second time, you divide it into sections, so make it easier for yourself. Find the different parts of the argument. Every argument is a good argument is going to have specific parts that are true to every single argument. So you want to divide it into those sections and label them. So you're going to say this is the claim, this is the issue, this is the opposing viewpoint, etc. You also want to write notes in your margins, of course. So questions, things you might have a question about, things you might agree with or disagree with, things you don't understand. Just write the main idea and or questions next to each paragraph as you're reading. So that way you're really not having to do twice the work this way. And then lastly, summarize those notes into a paragraph. So really you just need a couple of sentences that says, this was what the point was, this was what these sections were, this was what my information was, here's my questions about it. You want to break down or analyze your argument. So summary, of course, is very different than analysis. Analysis is where you start putting your emphasis, your thoughts, your ideas into understanding the article. And you're really starting to point out and show the different parts of the article, show what works and what doesn't. And it's your job to kind of break it down and have a very strong voice about what you've just read. That's what analysis is. So when you're doing analysis, you really want to start with first, what was the writer's purpose? And this goes back to what we talked about at the beginning with the potential bias and what is the stance and what is the writer trying to accomplish in creating this argument? Are they trying to convince you of something? Are they trying to show you two different sides of an issue? Are they trying to show you why one viewpoint is wrong? Or are they trying to show you that multiple viewpoints have merit? So what does this person get out of writing this essay? What do they get if they convince you of something? Who is the intended audience? Not every article is written for every person. When we turn on the news at night, it's a very different audience than when you go on to, say, BuzzFeed versus something like Fox versus CNN. It's all very different audiences. So you want to make sure you really understand who is the audience for this piece. Key terms, make sure you understand any key terms that are clearly defined. And then, of course, you make sure, again, is the writer credible? If they're not a credible source, it's very easy to dispute or disprove the argument. And lastly, does the writer provide good, clear, and relevant support to back up their claims? So do they have the evidence to support their ideas? If they can't give you evidence, then it's not a good argument. So repeals and rebuttals are really interesting. Emotional appeals are legitimate, and a lot of argumentation has emotional appeals in it. If you think about, say, your favorite Christmas commercial, I'm going to think of the Christmas commercial with the polar bears and Santa for Coca-Cola. That's an emotional appeal. They're not trying to tell you that Coke is refreshing. They're not trying to tell you that Coke has certain, pick-me-up capabilities. It's about an emotional appeal and nostalgia. So it does work, but you can't depend entirely on emotions. You have to have some type of logic within most argumentation. And then that's where your evidence usually comes in to support your argument. So one thing that an argument really always should do is to take into account other viewpoints. So I want you to think for a second about politics. I think about one of the presidential debates. I think it was the second one. There was a question from an audience member who asked both Clinton and Trump what was one thing they liked about each other. And this is basically what you're supposed to do in an argument. You have to have a very strong stance. So you may be arguing, X, Y, or Z, but you have to acknowledge that there are other viewpoints out there that have legitimacy. So you can say something like, chocolate ice cream is the best ice cream. I know that some people you can say, however, I know some people like vanilla because it's clean and refreshing. And then you would go on and you would refute that argument. You would say, while this is true, I still believe chocolate has a better flavor and a good applicability for all kinds of recipes or something like that. So basically, you acknowledge and then refute opposing viewpoints. And what this does is it allows people who are trying to poke holes into your argument not be able to poke those holes in your argument because you've already anticipated their refutations against your argument. So when you're evaluating an argument, you want to think about the following. Does the author state the opposing viewpoint clearly? Do they present it fairly and treat it with respect? Do they refute it with good logic and good evidence? And then, do they acknowledge that there are some parts of their argument that cannot be refuted? This is really true maybe in the scientific community where you have arguments that have evidence and they have to acknowledge the shortcomings in their own experiments about what could have been wrong or what could have not been taken into account for an argument. Now, fallacies. Fallacies are really interesting. Fallacies basically are how people, as I said, poke holes into your argument. So fallacies come in a lot of different shapes and forms, and I'm going to go through some of them just so you understand them. So circular reasoning is one where it's called begging the question, which is basically where you just go in a giant circle and you never really answer the question. So you basically go in a circle round and round and round until the audience gets exhausted. And this is a fallacy because it's not true logic, and what it is just distracting from the main reasoning. A hasty generalization basically uses isolated examples or insufficient evidence to create a conclusion. So if you said all people who play soccer are athletic, and then you said, I picked up a soccer ball once, therefore I'm athletic. That's a hasty generalization. A sweeping generalization thinks that one rule applies to all people or all situations unanimously. So this is something like, all people who drink tea are calm. A false analogy is where you connect things that shouldn't necessarily be connected. And a non sequitur means that it doesn't follow. So there's no actual logical relationship between two ideas. So if you said puppies are adorable and I don't know, kittens are afraid of puppies, those two things have nothing to do with each other. So they don't actually connect. A red herring is when you try to distract your reader by raising an irrelevant point. So something like, if I tried to just convince you to read a certain book and you didn't want to read the book based on your political beliefs, and I tried to tell you that it made you a better person and it would round out your viewpoints and all these different things, that's really not the point. The point is you didn't want to read it because it didn't fit with your viewpoints, and that's okay. So that's kind of what a red herring is. It's not a great example, but it gives you an idea. Okay, so post hoc ergo propter hoc is basically saying that you assume that A leads to B simply because B followed A. So I got sick because I went outside is a logical conclusion, but it's not necessarily true. So just because I got sick, or just because I went outside, doesn't mean I necessarily got sick from going outside. So that's post hoc ergo propter hoc. And either or also is a binary situation where you assume that there's really only two sides to an issue, and that is also problematic. Okay, synthesizing information. So synthesis basically is where you take the idea of summary, you take the idea of other outside information, source information, and you bring those two things together. So summary is not the same as synthesis. Synthesis takes your ideas and the ideas of others and puts them together. And this is really not the same as taking the ideas of others word for word or verbatim. That's plagiarism. Obviously, you don't want to be doing that. But what you're doing is you are basically combining information. So an annotated bib is usually a good way to kind of help you do this. And basically what you do is you go through an annotated bib and you find your 5 or 6 sources for your essay or whatever it might be, and you do a very short summary of source number 1 says this, source number 2 says this, and you're showing yourself how you're going to be using those sources in your essay to create your argument. So hopefully this gives you an idea of how to break down an argument. You guys are going to go ahead and move on to your next assignment.